Hi, my name is Eric Nyman, and I'm from UNICEF's Children's Rights and Business team within our program group leadership team. And today I'll be speaking about integration of child rights into human rights impact assessments. Let me start with a quote from Professor John Ruggie here, just to situate children's rights within human rights due diligence. So he says, children are among the most marginalized and vulnerable members of society and can be disproportionately, severely, and permanently impacted by business activities, operations, and relationships. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, children make up about a third of the population in the world, up to half actually in many developing countries. And their vulnerability are due to a number of different factors that we need to take into consideration when we try and integrate children's rights into our human rights impact assessments. The first one is due to the physical and mental development of children, meaning that they can be quite severely impacted by things that might not be harmful to adults. This can be physical things like toxins or mental stresses as well. These impacts tend to be lifelong as well. So it's very important when we look at children's rights to understand that impacts that they suffer in childhood might actually be quite severe and long-term. Another thing is children's rights tend to be quite a hidden stakeholder for business. And what I mean when I say hidden is the company tends to interact with either their parents or other adults in the community. So it might be, for example, we're talking about the children of workers here, or the children of customers, or children in the community, and the company wouldn't necessarily see them unless they specifically look for them. Children also lack voice in the public discourse, typically speaking, and are really not often able to make their voice heard in these processes. I should also mention that the recent COVID pandemic has really amplified some child rights deprivations. For example, for the first time in 10 years, we're seeing child labor on the rise. And this is another reason to look specifically at children's rights within impact assessments. So how do you assess child rights impacts? Well, the first question here is whether you do it as part of your human rights impact assessment or as a standalone child rights impact assessment. Now, I would say that for most companies, what makes most sense is to have a very explicit child rights lens on its human rights, within its human rights impact assessment. Look specifically for children, because as I said earlier, otherwise you might not find them, but integrate this within a broader perspective. And this has to do with the fact that children's rights issues are often very much connected to other sustainability topics. They might actually form the solution to other sustainability topics. If you think about decent work for parents, for example, or if you think about issues like occupational health and safety, when we talk about young workers, data governance, for example, children's rights are particularly important. Another aspect of integrating children's rights in human rights impact assessments is that you need to be able to engage children as stakeholders. There are a couple of safeguards that companies need to be put in place to be able to do this in a safe and constructive manner. And often companies will be engaging with children's representatives in addition to children directly. A final thing to note here is that a lot of children's rights issues, much like other social issues, have highly complex root causes. We're talking about societal norms, poverty, and things like this. And the child rights impact assessment, or the child rights lens on the human rights impact assessments, allows the company to understand not just the manifestation of the violation, for example, child labor, but also why that is happening in order to be able to address the problem. Of course, as in any impact assessment, risk should be defined as both material risk, in a sense, risk to the company, but also salient risk from a human rights perspective, so risk to children in this case. It's important that those two perspectives come in because, of course, the company has a responsibility towards all its stakeholders. So what are child rights issues for business? This graphic here on screen comes from the Children's Rights and Business Principles launched in 2012. And here you can see some of the issues that business, or some of the impact business can have on children. Of course, we're all familiar with child labor, but also things like decent work for parents, decent work for young workers, protection and safety. How can we make sure that the children are not harmed by interactions with your company? In the marketplace, companies need to be aware of children's rights impacts regarding products and services, the internet, for example. children are users of the internet to a very high degree in most countries, and they face some particular risks when using the internet. Marketing and advertising, for example, of unhealthy foods is a really important lens if you want to think about child obesity, for example. And then, of course, in the community and the environment, we have a number of factors that impact on communities, but that might impact children specifically. For example, if you need to, in your land acquisition policy, relocate a community, you need to look at children's rights as part of that, because the new land might work for the adult population, but if there's no access to education or health services, it will not work for children. Now, when are some of the times when you need to put a heightened importance on the lens for children? I've outlined some ideas here, but essentially, if the company is operating in a context that has poverty, that has, for example, humanitarian situations, low enrollment in school, etc., then you really should put a specific focus on children's rights, because it's likely that you will see manifestations of children's rights violations in these contexts. Another one is around the company's workforce. If you have, for example, a large female workforce, this is common in the footwear and garment sector, manufacturing sector, or a workforce with a very low income that might impact on their ability to care for their children, this is another reason to go a little bit deeper when it comes to children's rights. Of course, if the company has products and services that are used by children, this needs to be explored a little bit of how this is used, what kind of impact this has on children. And of course, any activity with high impact on communities, like mining, for example, will likely also have a high impact on children. This is not an exhaustive list, and children's rights should definitely be a lens in any human rights impact assessment that the company undertakes, but for some factors, it becomes even more important. There are a number of different tools and evidence produced by UNICEF to help companies do this. I'm highlighting a few on the screens, and there'll be links in the description to this video. We have a tool on children's rights in impact assessments that outlines a broad scope of children's rights prompt questions for companies that are doing a human rights impact assessment, so they can easily spot their impact on children. We have specific tools for industries, like the Mobile Operators Self-Assessment Guide, and on specific topics, like the Child Online Safety Assessment Tool. And additionally, more holistic tools for industries, like the mining tool I show on screen now. Similarly, UNICEF has produced a number of pieces of evidence over the years. Many of these are sectoral impact studies, like the palm oil study from Indonesia, this mining sector pilot study, and the ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh and in Vietnam. We also have, for those who are interested in more specifically how a company approaches this specifically on children's rights, we have this publication prepared together with Millicom, describing Millicom's own journey in assessing impacts of children of its operations, and primarily the internet service provision through mobile phones. Now, as an investor, what can you do to make sure that children's rights feature in impact assessments of the companies and deliver results in terms of understanding of the child rights impacts of the company, of root causes and potential solutions? There are two major categories here. In your ESG assessment, you can use indicators that will look into this specifically. So, for example, does the company identify children as a stakeholder group and engage in consultation with stakeholders on children's rights? Might be a question. Does the company integrate children's rights in its impact assessment? Does the company include children's rights in its materiality assessments? Does the company communicate externally how child rights impacts are addressed? Incidentally, these four indicators were taken from the UNICEF tool for investors on integrating children's rights into ESG assessments, where you'll be able to find more of scoring and criteria for assessment here. In the sort of more active stewardship dimension, we also have a tool that I'm going to shamelessly plug here, which is coming out in Q3 of this year, which basically tries to outline what investors can do on child rights in stewardship activities. A few things you can do to further specifically child rights impact assessment is, for example, through your expectations. You can formulate an expectation on child rights being part of the company's human rights impact assessment or sustainable impact assessment. You could also engage them directly around impact assessment and baseline assessment of performance. So to, for example, speak to the company, help them find guidance and set the parameters of integrating children's rights in the human rights impact assessment. One thing to mention here is that much like all social issues, children's rights results are a journey towards change. So one thing I strongly advise investors to do here is to not look at the situation of children in a sort of static way only. Does the company have child labor risk? Does the company have incidents? These are sort of snapshots in time. They tell you very little about the eradication of child labor and what the company is doing to actually help children get out of labor. This, as I said earlier, has a little bit more complexity to it. Child labor is often strongly related to poverty, to access to education, to social norms, things that the company might not be able to solve through only its child labor approaches. It requires interaction with other actors, etc. And that's why I think that collective action on some of these more complex issues is probably a really good idea for investors to consider when it comes to children's rights and probably most social issues and human rights issues. A lot of these root causes are complex, and it's not really up to a company or perhaps even an industry to solve them. There needs to be collaboration with other actors like the government, like civil society, etc., to be able to actually move the needle on some of these root causes and actually address the problem in a sustainable and effective way. Another area for collective action that might be quite important when it comes to impact assessment and understanding the impact of a sector or a particular business is collective action on improving disclosure on children's rights. Disclosure on children's rights is generally quite poor, although there have been a lot of progress in the past 10 years. But generally speaking, companies don't really disclose a whole lot of information on children's rights, even where we know that there is activity. So that's another area where investors can engage, can help raise the standard, and also which allows investors to actually have an understanding of the risk and the management structures in order to comply with human rights due diligence obligations. I hope that this was a useful starting point to think about children's rights in impact assessments, and look forward to any interaction with you in the future. Thank you.